Howdy, folks, and welcome to your storm chasing forecast show for Monday, August 24th. I am once again incredibly excited to welcome to the show another amazing coach that we have just added to the roster here at Storm Chaser Coaching, Jim Tang. How's it going, man?
Great. How about you?
Dude, I am so freaking excited. We have had some incredible growth over the last few weeks with people that we've added to the team. And just like Drew Shearer, who did a few shows last week, you have come highly recommended from everybody that was already part of our forecast show team. So I'm super excited to start knocking out some of these with you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Cool. By the way, I should have introduced myself. Bad host here. I'm Gabriel Harbor. Again, he's Jim Tang, and we are going to dive right into the categorical outlook that you have up on the screen. And it is, by the way, one of the more diminutive 2% tornado risks that I think you are ever going to see. So, Jim, what do you have for us there?
Yes. So for the categorical outlook, we have a slight risk up near the Sandhills of Nebraska and southwest South Dakota, and a larger marginal risk surrounding that, which includes the Dakotas, all the way back to Salt Lake City. But what we're going to be focusing on, and what you guys are probably more interested in, is this area of marginal risk down in the southeast. We have a 2% tornado risk in coastal North Carolina here. And this 2% tornado risk goes from pretty much the North Carolina, South Carolina border near Wilmington all the way to the Outer Banks. So here's the 500 millibar large scale pattern. The risk areas west in the Dakotas and out in Nebraska are the results of this trough near Saskatchewan and this kind of large scale wave up here. What we're going to be focusing on is the risk in North Carolina, which is on the tail end of this large gyre kind of system over southeast Canada, over the northeastern United States. This has been a persistent feature over the last couple of days, but on the tail end of this trough, we have some moisture and instability that are going to be creating some storms up near in the Carolinas.
Jim, I know we're not mainly going to be talking about it here on this show, but I did notice some chatter in our group chat for the forecast show. People were talking about maybe some Canadian knowledge getting flexed, and technically I know Canadians don't count, right? It all cuts off at that border. But do you think that for our Canucks who might actually be listening in, do you think that there might be something for them?
Yeah, up in Canada, there's this close to 500 millibar low, and there's a lot of cold air aloft associated with those cold 500 millibar lows. So sometimes they're regions of greater interest, sometimes because there's also a lot of what's called cyclonic vorticity, a lot of spin under those 500 millibar lows. So that could be a little interesting up in Saskatchewan and Manitoba.
Yeah, so if any of you are interested in chasing that, my recommendation is go ahead and figure out Coach Aaron Jajak's location and then just trail him the rest of the way because he will undoubtedly be out there chasing that. Before we let Jim continue his forecast, we're going to talk about WeatherFront for a moment because unless you've been living under a rock, you have heard that there is an Android version that is 100% publicly available. If you do happen to have an Android, WeatherFront is available for you now. So link down in the description, and they have something very special for all the Android users. If you sign up, not only do you get that 7-day free trial that is always available to new users, but you're also going to get 50% off your first month. And by getting the mobile subscription, it gives you access to the web browser and the desktop app. Jim is on the web browser right now, so you'll be able to link your account there and have access to all these cool tools. The present mode that he's actually going to be sharing from, link in the description. Definitely check that out. All right, Jim, heading down further into the atmosphere, what are we looking at?
Yes, so this is the mid-level wind at 700 millibars, which is about like 10,000 feet. Not too much different from the 500 millibar look. We still have that large gyre again over southeast Canada and the northeastern United States. Whenever we have these large troughs that are a couple days old, the winds between 700 millibars and 500 millibars are going to look pretty similar. So not really much new information there. At 850 millibars, which is around 4,500 feet above sea level, few things to know. Again, you still have that large gyre up north. Down south, you can see in the Carolinas, there is a little bit of a speed max, slightly stronger 850 millibar winds in the Jacksonville, Wilmington area. So that's something to watch. It might boost low level shear a little bit. On the other hand, sometimes you want weaker winds in this level, and we'll talk about why. It's a set that we have seen, for example, yesterday. on August 23rd. We had a big water spout, or actually it was a tornado. It was actually, I think it was on land, but it was tornado water spout. It was some feature that developed on the sea breeze. And I want to talk about how these could be similar. So now I'll start looking at the surface pattern. So this is the 2 meter temperatures. One thing to note here is that if we loop this a little bit, around 2 p.m., we can start seeing a pretty significant temperature difference between basically the I-95 corridor. So Lumberton, Fayetteville, Raleigh areas, they're all around 90 degrees. And then out over the ocean, you still have 78, basically 80s temperatures over the Atlantic Ocean. So this pattern creates what's called sea breeze, where the cooler air over the ocean starts rushing into the warmer air inland. And this kind of mechanism is very common over the southeastern United States, along the Gulf Coast, along the Atlantic coast during the summer, where you have this temperature difference. And this sea breeze is a boundary. And we in storm chasing love boundaries. They create stuff, they make stuff happen, right? This sea breeze is going to be the focus of thunderstorm development. And I mentioned the tornado yesterday in Florida was partially caused by a sea breeze boundary. And so I'm going to pull up. Yesterday, there was this tornado in Port St. Lucie, and this was a thunderstorm that developed on the sea breeze boundary. And we all know boundaries contain a lot of spin, and storms that anchor onto the boundary can ingest that spin, eat that spin up, and that can lead to a tornado. So this is exactly what happened yesterday. And if we look at the soundings, we can see that there's very weak flow through the entire low and mid levels of the atmosphere. And so, one thing to note here is that when you have a boundary, you have storms on the boundary, sometimes weak flow, weak shear can allow those storms to anchor on the boundary a little bit longer, eat up a little more of that spin, right? And so, the fact that we have a little bit more low level shear, but not too much, that could be favorable for storms to remain along that boundary, remain along the sea breeze boundary, and potentially spin up something interesting. So if we look at yesterday's setup in Florida, you can see how, again, we have really warm temperatures around Port St. Lucie, Clewiston. Basically, inland Florida, you have upper 80s, and over the ocean, they're slightly cooler. You have 80s, lower 80s, and West Palm Beach is at 78 degrees. And you have essentially this boundary that kind of comes up to Port St. Lucie. And at around 5 o'clock is when the tornado happens. So you can actually see there's a little temperature differential there. And that boundary there helped that tornado form. So the reason that I was talking about Port St. Lucie was watch out for that sea breeze interaction. And when we go over the cams, you'll be able to see around the 3 o'clock time frame when the sea breeze starts coming into North Carolina, you'll see storms form along that sea breeze. All right, so for the dew point map, we have again pretty rich moisture. This is something that you would expect for this time of year. You have 70s dew points, just rich maritime air. This is pretty much what you would expect. With these rich dew points, with this rich maritime air, we get pretty stout capes, upwards of 3,000 joules per kilogram in this area in southern North Carolina.
I love that forecast, especially the comparison between yesterday's event and what we might be dealing with today. I think that sort of thing, figuring out how to draw analogies to past events, is definitely a way that people can sharpen their forecasting skills. Because at the end of the day, this is all just a big game of pattern recognition, right?
Yep, correct.
Now, you went over why those weaker 850 millibar winds can actually be helpful in situations like this, and I know it's not the exact same mechanism, but it got me thinking that this is how, when you're talking about supercell tornadoes and deviant tornado motion, what you really
Mhm,
need is that really strong low level shear, and you need that
mhm.
sort of weaker upper and mid level shear to allow those tornadoes to occlude and move off with the low level winds instead of moving with the mean wind that they would normally travel with. And so it just reminds me how whenever we have something that we take as a given in the atmosphere, it really is all dependent upon the surrounding factors, and how it's really important to not actually just kind of go in autopilot mode and think to yourself that one thing is always the best. So I think that's a really important lesson, and appreciate you sharing that with everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything is contextual, right? I talked about water spouts and boundary tornadoes, but also land spouts, for example, right? You want weak, low level winds. You don't want too much shear, right? That's why Colorado, like all the setups are dinky with very little shear and all that stuff. Everything is very much contextual. And as a forecaster and as a storm chaser, you learn to appreciate that there's different flavors and setups, and the context matters. And there are no rules that apply to everything, right? So everything has to be evaluated on a case by case basis.
Speaking of, if somebody was wanting to see water spouts, is this the
Mhm.
type of setup that could produce those where they would just actually hang out over the ocean as opposed to coming out on land? And is there anything different we would need to look at to actually predict where those might occur?
No, yeah, I think you're right about water spouts. So it depends on where the sea breeze ends up and where the storms end up forming. Certainly, this time of year, with the water temperatures being as warm as they are, that contributes to a lot of level of buoyancy. So this time of year is a hot time for water spouts, right? So a lot of water spouts has happened this time of year. So I think the 2% there is not just for tornadoes, for land tornadoes, but also for water spouts that might wander onto land or come close to the shoreline, that kind of thing.
And I was also sneakily trying to make sure that we gave a little bit of an assist to all of our fish friends that might be watching the show, so that way they know they can be involved today as well. You don't have to be terrestrial in order to actually appreciate storm chasing. Hopefully, there'll be a special marine
Mm.
warning. You were talking again earlier about that weaker 850 millibar flow perhaps being helpful for keeping those storms anchored on the boundary so they can
Mhm.
ingest that vorticity for a longer amount of time. Does that same thing apply to the 500 millibar flow? Because I know with this setup, we're really looking at a glancing blow from that 500 millibar wind. Could the difference of, say, 25, 50 miles, if you're looking at meso analysis and you're seeing a, I'm not sure, maybe like a 40, 50 knot wind versus a 25, 30 knot wind, would you actually maybe want to target further south to get away from some of those stronger winds so that your storms have a chance to stay on that boundary longer?
Yep. So in this case, we have about 25 knots of wind at 500 millibars. So that's a pretty weak shear. And again, I agree with you that you want to target slightly weaker shear with some of these boundary events, just so that if, for example, as you were saying, if the winds at 500 millibars are like 50 knots, a lot of times what will happen is the storms will try to anchor along the boundary, but then they'll get steered off the boundary very quickly, right? And so that kind of forces your boundary to only work under certain orientations, right? Where the storm motion has to exactly match the boundary and you don't have much margin for error there. So yeah, I to your point, I agree. Having this weaker 500 millibar wind around 25 knots will probably help a little bit.
Real quick before we jump into the CIMREF showdown with Jim, I'd like to remind all of you folks that the best way to support Storm Chaser Coaching is by clicking that join button below this video and joining our channel membership. It is only $3 per month. Technically, that's a lie. If you're on an Apple iOS device, it is $4 per month because Apple has to take their cut. Boo to the App Store. But it is the best way you can support the channel. It's cheaper than a cup of coffee as long as you're not buying it from like a gas station, like a Speedway or whatever. If you're getting a nice cup of coffee at Starbucks, it's definitely cheaper than that. And you also get some awesome perks. You can click that join button and learn more about them if you're interested. And with that, Jim, let's go ahead and take a look at what the CIMREF is showing on all the cams. Let's see if that sea breeze actually shows up in the analysis.
So this is the her, and I'm gonna move back a little bit. So this is in the morning. And then as we loop through the hours, you can see that around 3 p.m., as that sea breeze starts marching inland, storms erupt around Wilmington right at that time. And they become pretty stout around 4 or 5 p.m. And they continue until around 7, 8 p.m. till sunset when everything moves offshore.
There's our fish water spout right there.
And the RFS, if we loop this back, shows a little bit more inland, but again, storms erupting in the early afternoon. If we look at the RFS MPAS, we can see that at again 2 p.m. storms start really bubbling near Wilmington and Myrtle Beach, and they become pretty widespread by 3, 4 p.m. And if we look at the ARW, it also shows something very similar where at 12 p.m. it's relatively clear, and then by 2, 3 p.m. you get more widespread. Especially 4 p.m. you get more widespread thunderstorm development, and then they move offshore by 5, 6 p.m.
So it seems like this is a day where pretty much everything, because it's confined to such a small area and it requires such a localized mesoscale phenomenon to happen and come together, we have a lot of agreement across our camps today.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
All right, perfect. I think that is a show. So, anything else you wanted to add?
That's it. How'd I do?
That was friggin' awesome. Remember to check out those links in the description below and then watch another video.